And here we are. Welcome everyone to the NAVA Advocacy program. I can see a number of people coming in. Thank you to Leah, my colleague, Leah Reid, who is just putting up the link to the live captioning. And thank you to Helen, who is in Brisbane and handling that live captioning. I can see people coming in. Please let us know on the chat where you are. We've generally had wonderful range of people from across Australia and from around the world, and we'll see how people come in and let us know where they are. And those who are coming in, wave hello to John Daley from the Grattan Institute. Hello, John.
Hello, it's a pleasure.
Oh, it is great to have you. Oh, hello, Brisbane. Hello from Art Space Mackay on Yui country, tropical Queensland. It's crisp, cool Melbourne here today. We had a wonderful storm overnight, and that's really opened up a nice big sky for us now, but I think much, much cooler than tropical Queensland. Oh, Margaret in the Barossa Valley today. Oh, lovely. Hello, Margaret. Oh, and hello, Alicia, tuning in from the Mallee People's Land in Glossop in regional South Australia. Oh, it's so nice to see so many of you. And Wu Ren Yu, very, very nice to see you again from Taiwan. This is the first week of the second chapter of the NAVA Advocacy program. For those who have been following us for the last few weeks, this program builds up to Arts Day on the Hill on the 12th of August, to a good national day of focus on advocacy in the arts. But it's also about building our skills and our connections across all the different senses of advocacy. We've just spent the last 4 weeks talking about the arts in a range of different publicly oriented ways. We've talked about First Nations advocacy. We've looked at artist perspectives on last year's Arts Day on the Hill. We've looked at sector body leaders from the Australian Museums and Galleries Association and the National Public Galleries Alliance. And as we end each of the 4-week sections, we had a Q&A with a politician last week, John Alexander, the co-chair of the Parliamentary Friendship Group for Contemporary Arts and Culture. So that was our first 4 weeks on introducing arts advocacy. These next 4 weeks are about policy and policy literacy. We then go into engaging with the media, and then our last 4 weeks are about political engagement as we head into Arts Day on the Hill. There's Anna from Natimak on Watchaballock country. I adore Natimak. I'm not there often enough. The Natty Fringe and certainly their small town transformation is one of my most favourite things about Natimak. So hello to Anna. I see there's others who are about to type and get started. Now, as you know, our sessions are recorded. They are also transcribed, and there is live captioning. And for those who have the chat view open, I hope that's everyone, there is the link to the live captioning. And hello again to Helen in Brisbane, who is captioning for us. All of these sessions are then available the very next day on our website. And thanks again, Leah, for posting the link to the live captioning. Oh, and hello to Anne from sunny Bomaderry, and Alex from Marga says hello to us both. So yes, all recorded, and there is also an advocacy handbook, which is available for NAVA members only through our website. We'll talk more about that a little bit later on. So we've got we've got about 50 of us here at the moment, and we're a good 5 minutes in. So let's make a start. I am here on the lands of the Bunwurrung and the Wathaurong Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, lands that have been cared for and nurtured by First People since time immemorial. And it is my great pleasure to welcome John, who is someone who I have benefited from great critical and interrogative conversations over some time. John, of course, is the CEO of the Grattan Institute, which is Australia's leading domestic policy think tank. He was the chair of the Research and Strategy Panel of the Australia Council, has been deputy chair of Malthouse Theatre, and is currently the chair of the Australian National Academy of Music. John, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And where are you today?
So I'm in South Yarra today with the Overflow book collection.
Yes, I'm here in Esther's garage with my beautiful wheels, and also beautifully surrounded by books. There is so very much to ask John about, starting to look at policy literacy in the arts, but also where the arts sits. I'm going to ask John a series of questions. We're going to have a chat here for the next hour. And then our final half hour, we'll get more into the workshop session, and we'll say bye to John. And I can see the final rays of sun streaming in through both of our windows, and there will come a time where it gets too dark, and then I will awkwardly reach over and turn my lamp on the way that I do. Now, Gemma Weston has very accurately pointed out that, yes, just behind me there, this is a mirror image, is a colour clock by Rebecca Bauman, WA-based artist. I'm very, very proud to have bought that from a Pika fundraiser some time ago. It's a special edition CMYK colour clock by Rebecca Bauman, and is truly one of my favourite things. I absolutely adore it. John, let's get right into it. Policy development in arts and culture is not something in Australia that we've seen survive changes of government. And if we look at the machinery of government, just in terms of where the art sits, that has also changed over time and makes it quite difficult, I guess, for those within government to sustain a policy approach, and for those of us outside of government to advocate for a policy approach. So tell us a bit about where does the arts sit now, and how would you characterise the policy framework in which it sits?
So I think the first thing you've got to remember about the arts is that in monetary terms, it is very small. You know, if you want to understand, why don't we have a department named arts? And the answer is, well, there's lots of things where the government only spends 1% of something, of its money on something, and it doesn't get to be in the title. And so given that that's where art sits, and you've got to remember that every dollar we spend in the arts is a dollar we're not spending on schools or on hospitals or on roads. It's always going to be a difficult ask. So that's kind of problem one. Politicians don't have to pay attention to it in the sense that it is not so large that it just wipes out everything else. I'll talk later about people who say, yes, but the arts is worth X percent, X billion dollars a year. I'll talk later about that argument, because I actually think that's one of the big issues that the arts has got, is getting kind of sucked into those arguments. But in purely monetary terms, it's not big enough to frankly change the numbers. So that's why it gets relatively little attention. The second thing is, in terms of what, in quote, arts policy looks like and means, to be blunt, the vast majority of arts policy looks like, please give us money. Now, that's not the only thing that arts asks for. So occasionally we'll get stuff around copyright. And I've got to say, as someone who works in public policy, I'm not sure we've got the copyright settings right. And I suspect I may offend some of the people on this call. But for example, I am a big believer that, as someone who has got an interest in the arts, a much broader fair use exception would be a really good idea in general. Why do I think that? Because when we're really trying to protect artists, what we're trying to do is say, I see it, here's your picture, book, whatever it might be. You're not allowed to reproduce the whole thing. I get that. I completely get that. I am completely happy with copyright law that stops that. On the other hand, when you take a very small element of it and use it somewhere else, to be blunt, artists have been doing that for several 100,000 years. And trying to prevent them doing it is actually unhelpful to the arts rather than helpful. So I look at those two areas in terms of, well, just give us more money and please give us a bunch of exceptions in the Copyright Act or particular things in the Copyright Act. plus the fact that, as we'll probably come to, when arts is asked, well, why should we give you money? What market failure, if you like, are we trying to, deal with here? Why is it that, government should subsidise the production of art as opposed to the production of sourdough bread? You need to have a really good answer to that question. And I suspect a lot of the time we don't have a particularly clear answer, or at least not well articulated relative to the audience. And I think that those are some of the reasons. And then the final thing that arts tends to ask for is, please give us money for training. And ironically, that's where actually governments have, if anything, been overly generous over the last 20 years in particular. And I think one of the reasons for that is governments have bought the argument that in general, people will underinvest in their own education. There is an inherent market failure that people will not pay up front for their own education. Consequently, government needs to fund it. The reality is that employers don't fund it, because I know that I'm employing you today, but I don't know I'm going to be employing you tomorrow. So why would I sink a lot of money into your education today if I, as an employer, am not going to benefit from it? So treasuries the country over have kind of got the picture that, yes, we need to subsidise education. And I think it's no accident that arts education is, if anything, over-subsidised.
Okay, let's take a few steps back. So to go back to that sense of current arts policy and where it sits, because you said that arts policy at the moment it sounds like a lot like give us money. I think that is what a lot of arts advocacy sounds like. But I'm interested in arts policy. Though we don't have an arts and cultural policy in Australia that is written at the moment, there are obviously sets of principles by which ministers and then government departments are carrying out certain plans. And so we have, in a sense, an unwritten arts and cultural policy, which is about certain relationships between arts and infrastructure, arts and education. I completely agree that, the arts in its own department is fanciful. There is no such thing at the moment. Portfolios are, multi-headed beasts or collaborations, and being within infrastructure and regional is certainly quite helpful. But has that been, had that restructure been as the result of a policy announcement or shift, that probably would have been something that gave the industry a bit more confidence. So if we just look at what the arts and cultural policy of Australia is at the moment, knowing that it's not something that's in writing, how would you characterise that?
So I would characterise it as quite confused.
Yes.
So given that policy, on the ground essentially amounts to who do we give money to, on what conditions?
Yes.
And more, and obviously who implicitly do we not give money to, and who do we give more money to, and who do we give less money to? And more to the point, why? Now,
yes.
You will not find a document, as you know, that lays that out.
Yes.
And that, I think, goes back to the fact that we are very coy about, well, exactly what do we think we are trying to achieve with arts policy? And because we've never articulated that, and because in some ways, anytime you write that down, there's going to be winners and losers within the arts, not many people are very keen to write it down either. And instead, what it comes down to is, well, given that we don't want to kind of talk about how we divvy up the pie, let's just kind of keep talking about where there should be more pie. And as I said, of course, the problem is that anytime you're arguing that the arts should get more pie, you are necessarily arguing that somebody else should get less pie. And I think you've got to be really upfront about the fact that that is how government works. There is no magic pudding here that sort of allows us to simply throw another, $200 million a year at the arts without asking, well, who's going to get less, either today or tomorrow, in terms of, someone's got to pay it back sooner or later.
And so that confusion, as you say, of a set of principles that aren't written down, that are about giving some groups money on some kind of basis. There's a question here from Gemma Watson about those subsidy versus market failure, but also the social, mental health, etc. arguments for the benefit of art. There are, of course, often when ministers are put on the spot or are asked to talk about the value of the arts, there's often those conversations or justifications that connect the arts up more broadly, that are less about intrinsic value, that are less about specific industry subsidy. And Gemma's asking, do you find governments, politicians are more receptive to arguments subsidy rather than in terms other than market failure? Is it worth making those social, mental health, etc. arguments for the benefit of art?
So I think it is worth making those arguments. There's some other comments there about, well, what if we ask for space? And my point is, look, all that is doing is asking for subsidy in another format. And indeed, providing that subsidy in the form of spaces may well be the best way of delivering the subsidy. But let's be really clear, that's what we're doing. And there's also another question there about, well, but why don't we just take the money from sport? To which the answer is, well, politicians, they're making trade-offs. And so the question is, that goes back to the first question, well, but why should I give you more money as opposed to sport or health or education or any number of other things? So if you look at, I think one of the things we've got to do here is be articulate about what are the plausible arguments, and more to the point, which are the arguments that are really going to bite in terms of effectively giving the arts more money, bearing in mind there are lots of ways to give the arts more money. So I would put those crudely into the following buckets. There's an argument that says, let's give it more money because it leads to more economic activity. Let's give it more money because it serves some other social purpose, better health, better social equality, more employment, regional development, regional economic development, all those kind of what you might describe as ultimately they're arguments about everything other than art.
Yes.
There is an argument that you should give money to the arts because it's a status marker, and the people giving the money get more status. Do not underestimate how important that is. I would argue that's actually probably one of the most important reasons why money is in fact given to the arts.
Tell us more about that, John. What do you mean a status marker? And is that, do you think, something that influences the people who want to secure that status by contributing, or the way that they perceive others who then participate in the arts to share in that sense of status?
Yeah. So the economics literature has a concept known as a status good. So for those who haven't come across this concept, status goods are things that it's not like a glass that I buy so that I can drink water from. It's not like a lawyer's services that I buy because, that enables me to win other arguments and, get money. A status good is something that I buy because it shows other people that I have a high status. And the reality is a lot of art is to some extent about marking status. I know we'd all love to believe that it's more complicated than that, and it is a lot more complicated than that, but that is
on that measure,
part of what is going on. And to be blunt, you can look at an awful lot of what goes on in contemporary art, and it's about status marker. It's saying, look, I've got this thing on my wall that shows I am somebody who understands a lot, who's deeply cultured, It's marking my status. Now, one of the reasons that politicians give money to the opera and to big galleries, particularly the state galleries, is because they're really good at marking status. They hold very big, glamorous parties at which all the right people turn up, and you are heard and seen, to take the name of a well-known column. And that is what is really going on. To be blunt, why doesn't so much money go to, some small, independent, very exciting looking gallery relative to the National Gallery of Victoria? And the answer is, well, because in part, the National Gallery of Victoria can confer status on the politicians who give it and consequently get shown to take into the openings in a way that other galleries can't and don't. So I think there's that thing going on. Then there's the thing about legacy. Now, legacy doesn't matter to all politicians, but it matters to some of them, and it matters a lot to the ones that it matters to. And we don't have to think very hard about politicians who have cared a lot about the arts, who have basically spent most of their time since they ceased to be Prime Minister, essentially defending their legacy. But interestingly, I mean, there was a column written in the paper a couple of weeks ago saying, you know, in 50 years' time, nobody's going to really remember any of the policies that happened. No one's going to remember any of the business people. Actually, no one's going to remember anybody who played sport, but they will remember the artists. Now, interestingly, the author of that column was Jeff Kennett. So there are a surprising number of politicians who do understand that legacy matters. Now, not all of them understand just how important it is that the arts are to legacy, but it is absolutely something that most of them care about. You know, what is my legacy going to be? You know, as I was kind of thinking about this, I was reflecting, you know, what do we remember George for? King George. And the answer is we remember him for Georgian period. And what do we remember about Georgian period? We remember architecture, right? Can anyone remember which, you know, hands up anyone who can, you know, nominate 3 major policy shifts, you know, through the Georgian period? You'd be doing a lot better than me. But, you know, we all sort of think, we all sort of think Georgian, you know, like, you know, lovely sandstone, you know, a particular style of architecture. So this legacy thing matters a lot. Then there's 2 arguments that I have heard relatively little about, which I think is surprising because I think they're very powerful. So there is one about the way that the arts or particular arts forms, or more to the point, particular works can, or practices can define nations. And I think since Trump, since Brexit, since all of that, we've all got a lot better at recognising. Sorry, I may have hit the wrong button there. We've all got a lot better at recognising that. Sorry, I've got a bit of an echo here. I'm not sure why. We've just hit something.
Oh, it has suddenly started to echo.
Right. I don't know why that's happening. I'm going to turn the phone off and hope that might have something to do with it. Who knows why? Apple might have done that. 2
Johns are better than 1.
Yeah, that has worked. Oh, no, it hasn't. Anyway, we'll carry on. Yeah, in terms of Trump, in terms of Brexit, I think one of the things that's going on is that those politicians are appealing to a concept of them and us, that the nation is no longer what it was, and that there is nothing holding, in inverted commas, us together. And so they define us in terms of another, and in terms of what Brexit is not, what you know, how do we make America great again? That it's like the Brexit rhetoric, backwards looking. And I think there's a real place for the arts to play in terms of creating that understanding about what it is that we are. There's a big piece for us to do there. And then finally, there's a piece which is about the arts defining who we are as individuals.
Yes.
That is, in fact, what most people believe. It is ironically an argument that very few arts advocates make. Because when you do that, the Australia Council did a lovely survey a couple of years ago about the attitudes to the arts.
Yes.
And they asked people, do you think that the arts increase, you know, economic activity? And actually, most voters said, not really. And as you know, someone who works in public policy, I actually think that's the right answer. Not really.
There's a study that the Australia Institute are also about to put out, I think, in the next couple of days about exactly that, a sense of public and voter sentiment. And I've had a sneak peek at some of the results, and so I'm itching for them to come out because some are along the lines of what you described, and then some are surprising. Though I guess, like with a lot of that polling, it's very much around the question that someone is asked.
Yeah. But what I think does come through it is that what people do tend to say is, look, the arts define who I am.
Yes.
And participation in the arts, both as a maker, creator, and as a participant audience member.
Yeah.
Most people realise. And as I said, when you go and talk to individuals in the community and say, well, why do the arts matter? That's what they tend to say.
Yeah. Now, John, we're just getting some feedback that your audio has slipped a lot. Everyone, I've just sent John a couple of suggestions, but I'm going to repeat them just in case that didn't come through, which was we're going to try muting and unmuting. We're going to see if John's got some headphones and that the muting and unmuting might help. But I will, what I'll do now is I'll ask a very long-winded question, which gives John a chance to do a bit of muting and unmuting at his end. Because I think that's really interesting, that point about the arts defines us. It's about how we express ourselves. It's also about, that sense of identity in that more complex sense. If we have, to have a more of a arts and culture conversation, we talk about the contest of identity and so on. But this very question is also the one that is puzzling colleagues and arts advocates at the moment, in terms of if we look at now arts policy in the context of this current COVID-19 crisis and the kinds of direct and indirect support that's happening, and the exclusion of some industries from the broader income support measures. And so whether this has been deliberate or not, there seems to be a bit of a pattern of, the industries who are receiving less support, the arts in terms of the exclusions for some, for the income support measures, the exclusions of local government, the deliberate 3 times now exclusion of universities. And these tend to be those industries where people are expressing themselves, contesting identities, developing ideas, and so on. And so when we look at the next steps, focusing down now the policy environment, where again we don't have that broader arts and cultural policy that connects up with those other industries, and we're also not seeing those outcomes at the moment. How do we marry up that sense of the arts and identity, and perhaps that being something that the current government is less interested in when it comes to arts and culture?
Yeah, look, and it sounds as though we fixed the problem, whatever it was.
Your sound is excellent. I'll just check with the others.
So I apologise to everyone. So I think that in terms of connecting up that identity, one of the issues, of course, is that there are culture wars going on.
Yes.
And
yes.
There's no question that at least some parts of the government are pretty unsympathetic to some of the ways that some parts of the arts talk about life. Now, that said, I think that, ironically, in the advocacy itself of the arts, we can probably do a better job about how we are bringing together the country in its diversity, as opposed to pulling apart, individual bits and putting them at odds with each other. So, for example, I would look at there's a lovely sort of, ABC, of course, doesn't have ads, but
promotional segment.
One of those promotional things that they do that are not ads at the moment, which is basically a whole pile of people singing.
Yes.
From the kind of, their little COVID rooms, in a way that is both about their diversity and about the way that they are part of something bigger. So I think one of the issues is, and look, it's entirely legitimate for individual artworks to, be pointing out, this is how this whatever is different. That's, of course, has always been and will always be a legitimate part of arts and the arts. But there is a real value in things that one way or another talk about. Yes, all of that's true, but this is also how, in our diversity, we are part of something bigger.
Yes.
That is, with respect, inherently an argument that's going to appeal a lot more to Canberra, and that's going to be true for governments of whatever stripe. But it's not always an argument that we see the arts making. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that that should be what every artwork looks like, but I am suggesting that that is the kind of argument that is going to get more rather than less purchase with government. And if you are trying to advocate for the arts, just as if you're trying to advocate for anything, you've got to put your best arguments forwards for the audience, and the audience of politicians is always ultimately arguing, how are you talking about what we are rather than, you know, how you're not part of it? Because if you're just talking about how you're not part of it, then that's not really helping them very much. Yeah, I think that's the kind of issue around identity. And then I think there's also the piece around the way that we are helping individuals define their identity in ways that is diverse, but that has meaning for them. Because, of course, if you think about it, that's an inherently very liberal argument. What we're helping people to do is to choose their own way. Now note that all you have to do is kind of redefine that identity thing as helping people to choose their own way, and all of a sudden you're appealing to the right side of politics. And occasionally, you know, this game is about co-opting language.
Yes.
So I think, you know, talking about the way that making their own art or going to participate as an audience member one way or another, and I include an audience member, you know, going to a gallery to view art, or viewing it in any other context, is part of choosing my own way, choosing my own identity. Now, of course, one of the problems is that you then have to explain, well, as part of that choosing, why should government be paying for you to choose? But if you are putting that argument in a wider context of saying, look, the value of this activity much more generally is that we are helping people to choose their own identity, you know, if at least one side of politics, that's a much more powerful argument than many of the alternatives.
And it's one, I think, that had more purchase in previous decades, whether we're talking about a Labor or Liberal government. And it's often remarked in the sector, in the industry, that the sector, in terms of artists, but also in terms of arts workers, was actually more culturally diverse in the past. There were specific policies around that, and the notion of Australian identity as being culturally diverse was something that was of interest politically. At the moment, though, when we look at that question, there's often this notion of, you know, what is Australian? There are a couple of questions there about, you know, that notion of distinctly Australian, you know, being a bit of a slippery slope, especially in the absence of, say, you know, National Indigenous Arts and Cultural Authority. But also a question from Madeline Thornton-Smith about maybe we should be fighting the idea that the arts are just there for an elite. Community centres are set up for a range of different backgrounds. We think about community arts and cultural development and community engaged practice that wouldn't exist without government funding. And so it also connects to a question further back, which was about you know, that we surely shouldn't be giving up on the notion of arguing for the intrinsic good of art.
Well, you see, this is what I'm trying to unpack. You know, when we say you know, unfortunately, you read an awful lot of stuff that basically says, well, the arts have an intrinsic good, and you kind of go, well, like, but what do you mean by that? I think what we mean are some combination of the arguments I've been talking about, particularly about the way that the arts can, in some ways, define who we are, bearing in mind that that's, of course, very complicated. There are multiple ways of defining the we, et cetera, but, you know, that's the rough concept. And then there's also the role that the arts play in effectively defining who I am. And, of course, there's an interaction between those two. And I think when we talk about the intrinsic value of art, which kind of, it's one of those things, either you already agree with that, in which case there's no point in making the argument, or you don't agree with it, in which case I don't really know what you're talking about. I think unpacking it in terms of saying, look, this is about partly defining who we are, and partly defining who I am, and we accept that both of those things are worth doing, then I think we unpack the concept for people who are going to be, you know, define their lives a little less like that. And if you think about it, politicians inherently are people who define their lives in terms of who have I helped today, and how have I changed the rules today? How have I changed social interactions today? Like, that's what they're good at. That's what we pay them for. That's what what means they get elected. Right? Now, people who define their lives in those bases, almost by definition, are those who are going to be defining their lives less in terms of, what art have I made, what art have I seen, participated in, because there's only so much space in a life, and politicians have created more space doing other stuff, so they've probably, as a general rule, got less space for this business of defining we and me and you in terms of artistic practice and participation. And so, to be blunt, we've got to spell it out to more of them than we might otherwise do.
And we had a great example of this last week where we had John Alexander, the member for Bennelong and the co-chair of the Parliamentary Friendship Group for Contemporary Arts and Culture, join us. And so we got to hear directly from him about, as you were just saying, what his typical day involves, so the kinds of people that he's meeting with, the arguments that he is putting across to his colleagues, how he draws on what he knows, sport obviously being his background, and sort of, joining those dots for people. And I think it's why we're doing a Q&A with a politician at the end of every 4-week chapter of our program, because it's so important to be reminded that when we're engaging with politicians, we are speaking to real people who chose to be elected for some reasons, whose day is not just about, hearing from us, but that notion of, the intrinsic that seems entirely obvious to us, and certainly us within the arts, is not a helpful argument for pitching beyond that. Let's take a little shift now from, we've been talking a lot about the advocacy side of policy in terms of how we would put the arguments. I'm interested now in the policy development side and in the work that you do at the Grattan Institute, where you have a number of program areas, and each one works with a specialist focus, and that gives you, bless you, the foundation there to produce some really, meaty responses and agenda setting, sets of policy for government, but also for public discussion. Arts and culture, of course, isn't one of those, but your work has touched on that in many ways, and there would no doubt be arts and cultural dimensions across the range of policy focus areas that you have. How do you see, when we're talking about, we just talked from an advocacy point of view about, mental health, about identity and so on. From a policy point of view, how at the moment does arts and culture intersect with both your focuses at the Grattan Institute and the government focuses that you are focusing on when you're putting out your reports and your position papers and statements?
So in terms of how we choose to do things at Grattan, we essentially ask, is it big? Is it something where the sort of quantitative analysis that we specialise in will really bite? And is it something where if we don't do it, it's not going to happen anyway? And you have to fulfill all three criteria. So that's one of the reasons we actually don't do that much work in the arts is many of the tough questions actually depend on a bunch of value choices about which, I can crunch the numbers endlessly, but I'm not actually going to come up with any particular insight. Because this argument about, well, how much do I value, who are we, who am I, how does art help us think through that, how does it give us pleasure, how does it help us understand the world, are things that are very hard to quantify relative to lots of other things. And so the kinds of tools that we have at Grattan don't bite so well. So that's why we haven't done very much on it, frankly. Now, that said, there is one very important area that we have got into where I think it really does bite. And that is, we did this work on crisis of trust, looking at why trust is falling in government. And we essentially came up with two things. We said, look, what's going on is, firstly, there is a general falling trust in government, which is partly driven by, quite extensively driven by the fact that, politicians are coming from increasingly narrow backgrounds. They're increasingly, frankly, doing it in such a way that it looks like they're doing it for the money, and so on. So, none of that, all of that is interesting, but none of it's got anything to do with the arts. And then we said, and there's another big thing going on in terms of these rising, this falling trust in government, rising minority party vote, which is around the increasing cultural gap between those with low levels of education and those with high levels of education, those who live in regional areas as opposed to those who live in city areas, those who have come from country, essentially migrants, those who are not migrants and who don't know very many migrants, and those three things tend to overlap. So our regional areas tend to have lower levels of education and much lower levels of migration, like really much lower. I don't think many Australians just understand how stark the contrast has become between pretty much any of our city areas, where typically you will get 15, 20% of the population born overseas. In fact, in city areas, you probably have more like about 40% of the population born overseas, of which typically 15 to 20% will have been born in Asia. Another 4 or 5% will have been born in Africa and the Middle East. You compare that to regional areas where, I think with the exceptions of Shepparton and Griffith, there is no regional area that has more than 3% of the population born in Asia. So it's a really big gap. And you see this play out, and then when you kind of try and dig into these voting things, and you're like, what's going on with Pauline Hanson and with a lot of these minor parties, one of the things that's going on, at least some of the time, and particularly with the One Nation Party, is essentially appealing to that division, which is the same division that Trump is largely appealing to and that Brexit appealed to. And when you dig further into that, you realise that most of the gap is actually about culture, because you kind of look into the sort of economic differences between, regions and cities, between high education, low education, between lots of migrants, not very many migrants. You discover, none of those gaps have actually changed very much in a long time. Regions, people typically earn less per person, but not by that much, and the gap hasn't got any bigger. But what has got bigger is this cultural gap. It really came through as we were kind of researching that piece. You asked, what did Australian culture mean in a mass culture sense? Forget about what's going on, in your, local arts gallery, which is invariably, a much more sophisticated and complex, well, not invariably, but often a much more sophisticated and complex conversation. What's going on in what I would describe as mass culture? So I go back 25 years, and mass culture looked like Man from Snowy River. Today, mass culture looks like MasterChef. Now, interestingly, MasterChef is a very multicultural program. You just pull up the photograph of the initial contestants for the last 2 or 3 years, and just looking at the photograph, clearly at least half the contestants do not have a parent or at least don't have two parents that both come from Western Europe or the US, very clearly. Don't get me wrong, I think that's a really good thing. But when you go to Benalla, or frankly, pretty much anywhere else in Australia, regional Australia, you look at who do you see on the street, and it doesn't look like that. Now, if you live in the city of Melbourne, or the city of Sydney, or the city of Brisbane, or the city of Perth, and well over 2/3 of the Australian population live in those really big cities, they look at the population of the people on MasterChef, and they look at who do they see in the street, and they don't see any difference, because there is no difference. But it's very different if you're in Benalla. And so, of course, the consequence of that is that you see people in regional areas feeling like the mass culture of their country is slipping away. Now, if that's what your problem is, your answer to that problem is also going to be a cultural problem. One of the really interesting things is that public servants, and for that matter, well, politicians may be a bit better at it, but public servants for the last 20 years have not been trained to think in terms of culture. They have been trained in terms of economics. And the division I'm talking about is just not an economic division. It's not about the money. Pauline Hanson's voters do not have materially lower incomes than anybody else. Where they divide is along these cultural lines. So if you're trying to heal those divisions, it's also going to be about culture. Now, our politicians kind of are a bit better at this because they, interact with people every time, but our public servants less so, and they're not used to the idea that government is in the business of culture and of creating stories and symbols and all the rest of it about who we are. Now, of course, if you go back long enough, governments understood this in spades. The Medici's got it, right? They were in the culture business, big time, and they were quite deliberate about how they manipulated that culture to create a story about we and they.
Yes.
Now, our governments in Canberra are, sort of groping towards trying to do that in history, and they do it very badly. And partly because they actually know so little about history, many of them, that they wind up sending exactly the wrong symbols to a whole bunch of people. But people who are involved in the arts, by definition, you are in the culture business. It is the business of arts to say, look, we recognise this problem, and we can help you. Now, that's a really powerful argument in Canberra. At least, ironically, for the politicians, if not for the public servants. But it would require a policy literacy from our arts that I think, by and large, they have not got. To understand that this has become one of the big cultural cleavages, and there's no point in just saying, well, all of those rednecks voting for One Nation, they should all grow up and understand our more sophisticated view of life, because, frankly, all that does is make the gap bigger, and that is not helpful.
Well, that's right. And all of us who were, raised with a language other than English, certainly my upbringing and everyone I grew up with had an experience within our ethnic groups that was equally as fearful and racist towards other groups. It's not simply something that is an anxiety or preconception that comes from people with Anglo-Australian backgrounds, and that sense of social cohesion. And again, those past policies of the 80s and 90s, I think, are paramount. But let's bring that together. Just what you were just saying, it just suddenly strikes me as being enormously pertinent to the right now situation of how do we get through COVID-19, because that difference between having an economic focus and a cultural focus as a government thinking about how do I create the future, how do I create the Australia that sustains, we have just been experiencing and are still experiencing the biggest disruption to our cultural life that we've ever known, most of us. It's something that has impacted on our behaviour, our daily choices, our mental health, every single aspect of our lives, as well as the entire economy. And so to transition out of this, we need an Australia that is going to be confident, resilient, keen to find ways of working together. In Victoria, where, as we know, there's been I think it was $135 million policy announcement around what the Victorian government called the experience economy. Let's look at what it's going to take to inspire people to get out there, to be confident, to boost business confidence, but also to encourage domestic tourism, given international travel will not be possible for a while, and net migration, obviously, we've got a series of long-term problems that are about to unfold. So surely now is a time for governments to be thinking about culture as well as about economics. So if you were to advise advocates, policymakers for the arts, if we were speaking to the COVID-19 Commission, if we're speaking to the people who are making those decisions around, okay, what are the reconfigurations now? What should we be prioritising in terms of cultural policy? And now I mean culture in its absolutely the broadest sense. What kinds of things would you be thinking should be being considered right now?
So ironically, the place I would go first is what I would describe as the commercial arts sector. When we think arts, we tend to think all the bits that government pays for. And of course, what we forget is...
No, we don't. No, a tiny, tiny fraction. Exactly. No, that's...
Most of the money is in rock concerts and musicals. But the really interesting thing, and this is, if I was advising the minister, this would be the first thing I'd be saying is, Minister, your cultural life as a country has, quite significant, is a lot of that is in the commercial sector. And that commercial sector has been really profoundly disrupted. Because for a long time in the popular music world, basically nobody made any money. No one's made any money out of recordings for a long time. Because of streaming, all the rest of it, basically all of that's a loss leader for the in-person concerts. Bad news, Minister. You are not going to be letting us have large mass concerts anytime soon. And it's all very well to say that the artists should do their thing online, but none of them are making any money out of doing that. So given that, to the extent that glue is not just football, but it's also popular music, how are you going to ensure that you have a popular music industry in this new world? Now, look, for the next 6 months, we're all on, some version of JobKeeper or JobSeeker, and, dirty secret. I'm not sure I'm going to be very popular on this call by pointing it out, but there are plenty of artists who have been working 3 days a week casually and making work on the remaining 4 days of the week, and, very occasionally taking a weekend off. And if they're working, casually 3 days a week, and they have been for a while, then they just became eligible for JobKeeper. And hey presto, they're earning 39 grand a year, which may not be a lot in absolute terms, but for many practicing artists, actually, they just went forwards,
Oh, yeah, that's going to be fantastic for them. Unfortunately, there are even greater numbers who are not eligible and who don't receive any of that, unfortunately. But for those who have,
true,
that's
but
fantastic.
on the other hand, they're getting double JobSeeker, which is more than many of them were getting in the past as well. So ironically, I think for the visual artists, I'd be saying, I know you're not going to like this one, I'd be saying, Minister, I'm not too worried about that right now, but I'm really worried about popular music because those musicians who have been part of that don't have an income stream for a really long time. And that stuff is part of what holds our community together. Similarly, I'd be saying, I'd look at the, roughly speaking, mass theatre of our time, which is essentially musicals. It's ironic, we forget that Puccini opera was the popular music of its time, with the popular musicals of their time. Everybody went to Puccini at the time. Today they go to, Matilda. Again, those things are not going to be holding us together at the moment and for the foreseeable future, Minister, because you are not going to let 1,500 people all sit in the theatre together anytime soon. So what glue are you creating? The other thing we used to do is have these, large popular events that governments put lots of money into. Although on a per person basis, not that much. The White Nights and the Sydney Biennial, the Sydney festivals of this world, that were events that brought lots of people together. They were things that were cultural glue. You're in a country which is a bit short on cultural glue in general at the moment. How are you going to deal with that problem? What sort of things can you create that we can do in a with COVID world that are probably that are one way or another are going to harness the artists we have got? Frankly, the artists that come out on the top of that pile may be different to the artists that were coming out on the top of the pile previously, because it's a different kind of problem. It's a different kind of question. It's a different kind of answer in terms of the things that will work in this new world. Many of the people who are doing well on social media would never have made it as visual artists doing their thing in galleries, but they do really well on social media. And arguably, that is one of the most important visual arts platforms of our time. It's very different, but, that's where we are. So I'd be thinking about to what extent do governments need to intervene in those things that have been very severely disrupted and were the first things to be closed, will almost certainly be the last things to open. And in the meantime, as you point out, many of the people involved are not particularly well supported by the interim programs that have been set up in terms of JobKeeper, JobSeeker, particularly in the performing arts, where, inherently, even those who were doing very well tended to move on what were effectively casual contracts from one company to another. And that's not because they had truly insecure work. It was just because, it's the nature of that particular industry, that's how the industry works. Individual artists work for multiple companies, essentially one at a time.
That's right. Yeah, and that is the mark of success in the industry, which is also something that's not always well understood by government. That successive casual work is a mark of success, that you are in such demand from a range of institutions, and that's artists, but it's also exhibition designers, installers, lighting designers, curators, etc.
All of whom I would very much say are part of this cultural production, and maybe we should use a slightly broader word than an artist, and then we'll wind up with something frankly ugly from a language point of view.
Now it's almost time for John to have to leave us, and then we're going to launch into the half-hour end of our workshop session. There's a question from Nicole that I'm just trying to clarify, that you mentioned earlier, John, that argument around the $111.7 billion in the arts is not a great one for us, because it's not a massive because it causes confusion. Nicole was just asking for you to clarify that.
Yeah, why don't I spell that one out? So the problem is, lots of people go to, frankly, very highly paid consultants to come up with numbers that say, my industry is worth X. And when you do that, you discover that the Australian economy, when you add them all up, the Australian economy is about the same size as the US economy. Which is because the way that those numbers are constructed is the kind of thing that 400 or 500 years ago we burnt people for doing it, and I suspect that was actually a better answer.
You could, Yanis Varoufakis will give us a great response to that one when it comes to the way that Greece's figures were inflated.
I'm not saying that the arts has cheated any more on its answer than anybody else.
I should say in response to that one, so that number is actually the government. So the Bureau of Communications and Arts Research, Nicole, that number comes from them. It's $111.7 billion. But I should say,
but only because it counts up a whole bunch of things.
It counts up a whole bunch of things, but it also
that we would not normally count as being arts.
Yeah, so it includes things like the communications aspect of advertising and architecture, but and so on. But it doesn't include the commercial arts sector. And it's something I've been
so sure about that. I think it does.
I've had a look.
Much more general. The issue is this. Let's put this in context. The Australian economy is, roughly speaking, $2 trillion. So on that basis, the arts is about 5% of the arts, but it's not. It's actually much broader than that. It's about 5%. Actually, if most ways you construct it, it's quite a lot smaller than that. But I think that the point is much more this. In terms of why should the government give us money, actually the government doesn't need to give you money to get most of that $100 billion number, in however you want to calculate it, precisely because those of us who play this policy game know that those numbers by and large add up to an awful lot more than the totality of the Australian economy. They are treated with a great deal of scepticism by the treasuries of this world. Ironically, that's where they probably have the least purchase. So when you show up to Treasury and say, give us money because we're so important, because this is how our number, Treasury by and large goes, yeah, yet another rent seeker. I know how you got that number and I know exactly how much it's worth. One of the other arguments is, but politicians do this for all of their kind of big infrastructure projects, which the answer is yes. And by and large, those too are fig leaves for things they want to do anyhow. In the same way that putting a big number on the arts is, we're not doing it because we actually want to make the economy so much bigger. We want to do it because we think the arts are worth doing. And my point is, well, if that's why we're really doing it, why don't we make that argument, that we are doing this because of the way that it defines us, defines me and you. And then if we want to appeal to, if we actually want to motivate politicians, then we say, oh, and by the way, it will also define your legacy. Oh, and we'll invite you to the opening.
And so it's kind of using, if we're going to use those figures, have them be a bit more cause effect as opposed to, oh, look, it's a big number. But also, really drawing that back to what you were saying earlier about what is likely to motivate interest.
Yeah. Now, one thing I should add to that is the ALP is much more interested in arguments that say the arts are going to help, social equality and social cohesion and arts and social equality and health and employment and all of the rest of it. Sometimes they do. I suspect that some of those arguments, in the same way as the economic arguments, are a bit overdrawn. And frankly, if that's what you really care about, sometimes the arts will be the best way of getting there, but by no means always. And again, we're really using them as cover for arguments that we really care about. And that's one of the reasons why I think arts policy has really struggled, is that without that clarity of what we really care about and what's really going to motivate people, if you instead put your first foot forward on an argument which neither you nor your audience truly believe in it, then invariably the communication is not going to be that effective.
This is a good and important point, and a very helpful one to end on, because we know that we have big and passionate audiences in the arts. We just need to be communicating honestly with authenticity and in ways that tap into both political motivations, but also that strong sense of us and identity. John, thank you so much for joining us. A few thanks and so on coming through on the chat there. This was really great and pointing us in some helpful and sobering directions to have to shift the ways that we're so used to talking about the arts and connect up with some broader issues and agendas. So thank you very, very much for joining us.
It's been a complete pleasure. And I'd just like to thank my wife, Rebecca Coates, whom I know many of you would know. She has been someone that I've thrashed a lot of these things through with. And before you all pile on, I should make it very clear that she and I continue to disagree on many of these things, as many married couples do. But nevertheless, she's certainly been very important in terms of helping a lot of these ideas to kind of get thought through.
John, thank you. And please tell Rebecca hello as well. I look forward to seeing you both properly soon.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, John. Bye. And for those who don't know Rebecca Coates, Rebecca is the director of the Shepparton Art Museum in Shepparton, which is close to Benalla, which John had been mentioning earlier. Now I see John has just pressed the button to leave, and his image at my end has frozen, and I'm hoping that I haven't frozen for everyone else. So if you can still hear me, can you please type in the chat so that I know that you can hear me? Okay, great, fantastic, wonderful. Lots of messages saying that we can hear. I think it's just the lag on saying goodbye to John. So that was lots and lots of things for us to think about. And one of the great frustrations that we have, of course, when we're talking about advocacy for the arts, but also policy more broadly, and we've been talking about this the last few weeks, is how do we advocate? How are we engaging with politicians as individuals and as parties, and how do we make those broader arguments? In last week's session, we heard from John Alexander, and then also from Zoe McKenzie, who I see is in the audience today. Hello, Zoe. And also from Darren Rudd, both people who have been engaged in these kinds of questions for a long, long time. And unbeknownst to us, JA was able to stay for the entire hour and a half instead of just that first 20 minutes. We're going to do a bit of a broader Q&A based on the last 4 weeks, and going into the sense of what we're picking up, what we're learning, what has shifted for us in terms of our advocacy, because of course the advocacy program leads towards Arts Day on the Hill on the 12th of August. And we've got our toolkit that we're developing and updating once per month. And those of you who are NAVA members have already got access to the first chapter. Who has already got access to that handbook? Let me know in the chat. And I should say, as I've mentioned before, that that handbook Of course, these workshops are open to everyone, with thanks to a particular philanthropist, Daniel Beeson, who has made all of this possible. But the handbook, so that we are true to our members, is available for NAVA members only. Michaela is saying she's a member but hasn't got the handbook. Should we be sent it? No, Michaela, all you need to do is log into the members section of the website and you'll find it along with our resources. And for those who aren't members, membership of NAVA starts at just $7.50 a month, which is cheaper than a couple of coffees, which, to repeat the bad joke I made some weeks ago on this, that's like one coffee for you and one coffee for me, but I don't actually drink coffee, so that's even more money that you've just saved there. And of course, being a NAVA member connects you to a world of resources for your practice, as well as the full range of advocacy work that we do. And thank you to Leah for popping up that membership link. Now, there are a lot of questions that people posed that we didn't get the chance to cover while John was here. What would everyone like to talk about in our next section? And I will also bring up that handbook so that we can look at some specific aspects of what we're learning and what we're developing. I'm now going to turn my lamp on because it's just starting to get a bit dark, so that we can start looking at our next advocacy steps together. So we've got a couple of people who are typing, and I am going to share my screen in a sec and show you some sections of it. So Sarah Miller is saying, I think we really need to be targeting senior public servants and policy advisors as well as politicians. And of course, Sarah, that is a substantial part of our work. Not a day would pass that I'm not speaking to the heads of arts agencies at state and federal levels, but also to political advisors. You're absolutely right. And it's something that Zoe emphasised, and also Darren at last week's session, the importance of maintaining those relationships. There were some questions that people asked last week about, but isn't it frustrating when you're maintaining a relationship with an MP and then the government changes, or, you know, they're not there anymore? I think Zoe pointed out that, in fact, the average MP is there for about 14, 15, 16 years. And that when they do leave, if they were someone who you'd built a great relationship with, then they are very likely someone who's going to continue to be helpful now. I think I've mentioned before, some of my most trusted political advisors are actually former ministers, premiers, etc., and also their former advisors. So thank you to Leah for just putting up that link there. Let's have a look at part of that handbook. And before I try to share that, sometimes at this part, at this section of the workshop, when I've tried to share that screen, we've had a bit of a technical glitch. So I'm hoping that that's not going to happen. And so when you start to see this document on your screen, then please let me know when it is there in the chat, and then I will know that you can see it as well. Thank you, Joyce Louis. Thank you, Larissa. Thank you, Carolyn. Okay, excellent. So this is part one of the handbook, which was for the last few weeks, and soon the next one will be available. And so it starts by talking about all the different things that we do together, and also what's the state of the arts right now, in a situation where career pathways are jeopardised, professional practice support for the arts is in decline, artists' capacity to sustain careers is undermined. But if we add the COVID-19 situation, we have, you know, the entire industry is disrupted by now. And so we do need to, substantially improve our advocacy and the way that we go about it. We talked in previous weeks about what advocacy is. So this notion of putting forward a vision, your vision, with confidence and positivity, and building those kinds of relationships where you can be having those conversations far more often and on a regular basis. John Alexander last week talked about the importance of his parliamentary colleagues hearing from all of us in their electorates, in your electorates. And we've also posted before the link to the Australia Council electorate profiles, which lets you do that really fantastic research before meeting with an MP. Since having that conversation and since looking at this, who has looked up who their local MP is, perhaps started to follow them on social media, who's been starting to have that connection? Because this is going to be exceptionally important in future weeks. So at the moment, there's 75 of us online, and at different times we've had, 50, 100, 200 more people as part of our group. So people already have. Tell us, those who have, how have you? Have you been doing a bit of research into who they are? Have you followed them on social media, invited them to things? What are the different specific things that you've been doing? Kate Smith says that her local Alicia Payne might be good in the future. Great. Marge Edgecombe talks about looking up the data on that site. Louise has been drafting letters. Fantastic. Carolyn's talking about research, preparing a short brief to send, and that's really great. And Bianca Couchman says general stalking on socials. I think that general stalking is actually really important. Connecting and following a politician on social media is a great way to sort of start to understand how they engage. Is it them who is writing, who's controlling that? Is it one of their staffers? What are the kinds of things that they're responding to and that they seem to be interested in? Nicolette, were you in Eden Monero? Yes. Eden Monero is going to be very interesting to follow. And yes, I don't know where that election has been announced yet. There's Kim Jamison from Art on the Move in WA, and she's doing one-on-one meetings, inviting them to event programs, sending out their annual report with an advocacy letter, and working across the state with key cultural colleagues, key cultural organisations to share learning and ideas. That's exceptionally important if you are in an organisation, is to be doing that. Staying in touch, but also in a quite strategic way. This is what we contribute to the state. You're talking to a state MP or federally. Adam Simmons met with Jed Carney. Fantastic. Told his personal story, attended a town hall meeting with Tony Burke. Tony's someone who is very engaged. That's great, Adam. Larissa's talking about looking up her electorate. Yes, and following the newly elected mayor on socials, who's keen to have a cultural summit within her first year, starting to identify who's who in the zoo in her area, baby steps for the start. Oh, Larissa, those aren't baby steps. I think connecting with local government is extremely important, extremely important. Someone asked the question, it must be an hour ago now, and my apologies for not turning to it. So somebody asked the question of how should we focus our advocacy? Should we look at local or state or federal? And the unhelpful answer to that is that at different times it is important to focus on different levels of government there, but to maintain an engagement with all, if you can, if you're able. Obviously, if all of us are doing this, then the critical mass of all of us combined means that we all do a little, and that has a big impact. Marissa Georgiou is saying she's trying to convince the Queensland Greens to adopt an arts policy. Now, this is an important time to be focusing on. State is, of course, when there is a state election, as is coming up in Queensland. And so later on in the year, NAVA will produce our election report card for Queensland. And so obviously if the Greens and all the parties have a policy for us to refer to, now's the time for them to get their skates on so that we can analyse, we can critically respond to those policies and make sure that they happen. But yes, local government is exceptionally important. They are the biggest owners of galleries and their collections in Australia. They have a range of councillors who are generally legitimately from that area, whereas at the federal level, it's often not even necessary that they are from the electorate that they represent, which is really frustrating. Angela's suggesting we need to figure out how to clone Gough Whitlam. This suggestion often arises, and it is extremely frustrating that he didn't think of that at the time, because he did come up with many other ideas. I had the great fortune of meeting Gough many times, and actually attending a kind of like a reading group with him when he was quite elderly, and he never lost that sharpness, and was an exceptional thinker, but also, yeah, just so passionately committed to culture and the arts. And this goes to a question that somebody else asked earlier, which was, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten who it was, so please feel free to wave me a note when I repeat the question, but it was about, okay, if we move the government more towards a cultural focus for arts and culture policy, then does that then tip us into the direction where government is choosing the arts and culture that they prioritise above others? But of course, the frustration with that is that is what happens at the moment. As we were saying with John earlier, there is no written cultural policy in Australia, and that of course means that the status quo continues. You know, certain funding relationships continue, and that disadvantages those who are trying to, you know, develop new art forms, break through, develop young emerging art forms, develop emerging organisations, and so on. Angela Hughes is pointing out that Andrew Bartlett is incredibly receptive to discussions about the arts for those who are in Brisbane. That is great to know. And the slide, the page of the handbook that we have on our screens at the moment is looking at that question of how do we focus our advocacy. And John touched on this. This comes from the broader NAVA advocacy framework, but John touched on this in talking about the kinds of conversations and language that we use. You know, sometimes we are artists or the sector, you know, just primarily talking to ourselves. Sometimes we do need to reach the public. Sometimes we reach politicians through the media. Sometimes we need to engage directly with policymakers who might be less interested in directly populist arguments and might be more interested in the longer term. But this is a you know, it's a complex nexus of a broader campaign approach. But when it comes to just the honing of our advocacy skills, it's so important to consider who we're talking about and in which context at different times. Let's think a little bit now about the current crisis, the frustration that we've been having in encouraging government to understand the value of supporting the industry at this time, but then comparing that to the media impact that stories about the arts has had. Let me know in the chat, have you, in the last few weeks, since this is the 10th week of this situation, have you been seeing more or less in the news about the arts? And what kinds of things have you been seeing? Exercising your advocacy judgment now, and imagining that when we look at the media and media engagement, we are in fact talking to the general public and not to artists and to the sector. What kinds of things have you seen in the media in the last few weeks, and how effective do you think those things have been? Oh, we've got 8, 9, 10 people typing at the same time. Oh, Louise hasn't seen any stories or news about our predicament. Louise, I'm interested in where you are, because I'm obviously in a position of feeling like, we've had so much coverage, but I'm keen to know where you are, Louise, in that you have not seen any. You're in Brisbane, okay. Gemma's saying lots of Carriage Works coverage. Yep, if you're in Sydney or the East Coast, absolutely. Kate says the media stories of people recreating famous artworks at home have made art fun. Yeah, it's been fascinating to see through people's social media engagement just how much people have been craving the arts. I see lots of people saying they've been reading stories about the bad news, so about industries nearing collapse, but at least the public is realising how badly the arts have been affected. Paola Mischioli talks about stories of casual arts workers who can't access the government subsidy packages. The approach to, loss of jobs, the music industry, Burke High School Q&A ending this. Oh yes, the song on Q&A. Wasn't that something? It's fantastic. I like this different format for Q&A where there is an artistic intervention at the end. Laura Tingle has been a very good advocate, Penny Koss. Laura is actually on the board of an arts research group. I forget which one. She and I have a mutual friend, and he was telling me, and I've completely forgotten which one she's on. But yes, she is. She's been a fantastic advocate. Kate saying lots of art people being interviewed, bringing out the old arts is worth so many millions as a sector. Yes. So yeah, that figure, and I must look that up again, because the last time I had a look at the detailed study that went into that $111.7 billion figure, it didn't include the commercial arts market, and it only includes some craft and design with a focus on jewellery. So I will have to look at that again, but I seem to recall, although it sounds like a massive figure, it includes some things that you think shouldn't be there, and then other things it omits altogether. Larissa's saying she's seeing more arts-related stories on social media, which probably reflects her own interests. Yes, the algorithm, the ratio, but in traditional media, not so much. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there have been a lot more stories, and then again, I'm in the biased position of having either been interviewed for many of those stories or knowing personally the people who are, and so it sticks in my mind and my algorithm and my ratio. But I guess what I'm seeing now is that disconnection between there being a lot of media interest, but that not translating into political response. And so again, we go to the advocacy framework where if there isn't that connection between artists, the sector, the politician, if we're sort of bypassing the public and the politicians by having this kind of conversation, the sector, artists and the media, then we're not having that direct connection either to policymakers who can make a difference or to politicians. Kate Warren saying Virginia Trioli also seems to be a pretty active media ally. And yes, absolutely. Virginia Trioli is a former chair of Gertrude Contemporary and has done a fair bit of facilitation and seeing in other work in the arts, and is also a collector. So yes, others saying that, lots in the media, but not necessarily something that is making a difference. And so if we've got those media articles, but they're not necessarily making that direct connection to policy and to the politicians, then having achieved all of that media impact, how can we as advocates direct those stories to politicians? What are some ways that we can do that based on the discussions that we're having so far? Because that impact is out there. You can link to stories that happened months ago. There is a page on our website on the COVID-19 Industry Advisory where we have a list, with thanks to Leah Reid, who is with us now. Leah is our Advocacy and Communications Manager. Leah has been updating the list of all of the media impacts that we've had, so you can very easily go to that page and grab one of those links. And so what's a way that you can use that media coverage now, do you think? We've just talked about connecting with people. Big thank you, Leah. Leah has just put that link there in the chat of all of our media mentions to date, so you can easily grab those and link to them. So that would be a fantastic opportunity to, as we said at the outset, what is advocacy? Advocacy, of course, is those compelling conversations that you have that come from your perspective, that tell your story in a way that nobody else can. As you've heard me say before, advocacy can be as simple as we have a conversation, and the way that I have put something has interested you, has been constructive and compelling, so compelling that you repeat that conversation with someone else, whether you agree with me or not. That's how we, in a very grassroots way, make that change, but also that's how we engage ourselves in that ongoing confirmation. Anna's talking about the MEAA, who I meet with probably every week or every other week, and as well as other industry bodies, and absolutely there is plenty that we are all doing together right now. So if you've seen something in the media and it relates to work that you do, that's a great opportunity to link to that article, and perhaps if you're on social media, tag in an MP and give a sentence or two about your direct experience. Or you could write them an email and say, I'm not sure, you must have seen the great media coverage that the arts is getting at the moment. These are the issues that we need addressed. The link that Leah has pasted there to our media mentions also links you to all the work that we've been doing around COVID-19 advocacy, including policy priorities. And so it's a great opportunity to take that advocacy step now and link to that, link to an article and say, here's how this affects me as an individual. I'm in your electorate and here's how it affects me. An even more powerful way is to do that, but actually get on the phone. So call your MP's electorate office. Chances are you won't be able to get through directly to the MP. You can certainly ask to make an appointment, which is a very good idea. But can you imagine if those electorate offices all around Australia were getting calls from artists and arts workers saying, look, the most important issue for me right now is this. Here's a media article where another artist talks about it, and here's what I think needs to change. So we're in that position right now, and we're almost out of time. So if you've got some last questions, now is the time to pop them into the chat, because we're almost out of time. But we're in that unique position at the moment where if we look at this nexus of how do we involve artists, the sector, policymakers who are looking long-term, politicians who are making decisions, the media who are amplifying our voices, and the public who are ultimately the ones who, we are all a part of. This is the Australia that we want to enrich. We're in a rare position now where we've actually got some substantial media coverage that we can leverage. And the best way for us to leverage that right now is as individuals. Because by appearing in the media, it's already achieved that mass impact. It has appeared on, for example, the media mentions that politicians are looking at. That's already happened. So how can we grab that impact now and amplify it with our own personal story? So next week on the NAVA Advocacy program, we're going to continue. It's going to be the second, here's what we've done so far. Next week will be the second week of our 4-week focus on understanding policy development. So we've just had policy literacy with John Daley, which is fantastic. Next week, we're going to look at global comparisons. Who's doing this well? Where does arts and culture sit in the policy priority of other countries? Sometimes politicians love being motivated by what other countries are doing. And we'll have Jackie Bailey, a global cultural policy expert, looking at that with us. The week after, achieving policy goals from within an invisible portfolio. How can we achieve those policy impacts? And our special guest, and I'm thrilled that he's joined us, is Mike Murdoch AO, who is the former secretary of the former Department of Communications and the Arts. And then to wrap up that bracket talking about understanding policy development, our guest will be Maria van Vacuum, the co-chair of the Parliamentary Friendship Group for Contemporary Arts and Culture, on how to influence cultural policy. So a Q&A based on everything that we've just discussed, that we can really build up our policy literacy. So everyone, thank you so much. As ever, thank you to Leah. Thank you to everyone at NAVA. Thank you to Helen for the live captions. You will find this session, the recording of it, and the transcript on our website tomorrow, and also the kit available for NAVA members. And don't forget, your homework in the next week is to grab one of those media articles, connect with your local MP and let them know what this means to you right now from your point of view. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night and see you next week. Good night.